The first Monday of September began like every other peaceful morning in Arthur Collins' home. Warm sunlight drifted through the kitchen window, carrying a faint breeze that stirred the curtains while the coffee maker hummed softly in the background. For the first time in months, life felt almost normal again. His wife, Eleanor, sat in her favorite chair beside the window with a novel resting on her lap. 3 months had passed since her spinal surgery, and although she still relied on a walker, she had started smiling more often. Watching her regain strength had become Arthur's greatest comfort. He believed the hardest days were finally behind them. Then a familiar SUV rolled into the driveway. Arthur smiled to himself. Their son, Michael, had been visiting frequently since Eleanor's surgery, often bringing his wife, Rebecca, and their son, Ryan, along with Ryan's young family. Arthur had considered those visits a blessing, a sign that families still looked after one another. He poured another cup of coffee and placed it on the counter, expecting another pleasant morning together. Instead, 4 car doors slammed shut. Children laughed outside before anyone knocked. Moments later, Michael walked through the front door without waiting to be invited in. Behind him came Rebecca, dressed as neatly as ever, followed by Ryan, his wife Sophie, and their 2 energetic boys, who immediately began running circles around the dining table. Arthur chuckled. Well, this is a surprise. No one laughed with him. Michael stepped forward carrying a bright yellow envelope. Without a word, he placed it carefully in the center of the kitchen table before pulling out a chair and sitting down. His expression was serious. Dad, he said calmly, we need to discuss the house. Arthur frowned. The house? Ryan shifted uncomfortably near the refrigerator while Sophie quietly gathered the children into the living room. Michael folded his hands. Ryan lost his rental home. The landlord refused to renew the lease, and they need somewhere permanent. This place has 3 bedrooms while you and Mom only use 1. Arthur stared at him, unsure where the conversation was headed. So, Michael leaned forward. We've already worked everything out. Arthur's smile disappeared. Rebecca spoke next. We found a lovely apartment nearby. It's smaller, easier to maintain, and perfect for your stage of life. We've spoken with the property manager, arranged the paperwork, and even scheduled movers. Arthur looked from one face to another, his pulse quickened. I'm sorry, he said slowly. Are you telling us to move? Michael nodded as though the answer were obvious. It makes sense. Ryan has 2 children. They deserve a proper home, and honestly, this house is becoming too much for both of you. Silence settled over the kitchen. Arthur felt his fingers tighten around his coffee mug. Across the room, Eleanor carefully closed her book and struggled to her feet using the armrest for support. This is our home, she said quietly. Michael barely looked at her. I know this is unexpected, Mom, but we're trying to think ahead. It isn't unexpected, Eleanor replied. It's disrespectful. Ryan lowered his eyes. Even he seemed uncomfortable. Michael sighed impatiently. Dad, you're 75. Mom's recovering from surgery. Ryan's family needs stability. It's time to think about everyone, not just yourselves. Arthur couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had spent nearly 40 years paying for this home, sacrificing vacations, working overtime, and repairing every broken pipe and cracked wall with his own hands. Now his own son was treating it like an empty building waiting for new occupants. Arthur slowly placed his coffee on the counter. His voice remained calm. You need to understand something, Michael. Michael crossed his arms. This house isn't available. The room fell silent. Not for Ryan, not for you, not for anyone unless your mother and I choose to invite them. Michael's jaw tightened. We'll talk again after you've had time to think logically. He stood. Rebecca quietly followed. Ryan hesitated at the doorway, glancing back with an expression Arthur couldn't quite read. Regret, perhaps, or embarrassment. Then they were gone. The front door clicked shut. Only silence remained. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for Arthur's. He squeezed it gently. Then his eyes settled on the yellow envelope still lying untouched in the center of the kitchen table. Michael hadn't forgotten it. He had left it there on purpose. Arthur stared at it for several long seconds. Whatever was inside would reveal exactly how long this plan had been unfolding, and somehow, deep inside, he already feared the truth. Arthur remained seated long after the front door closed. The house felt strangely empty, though only moments earlier it had been filled with voices. Eleanor lowered herself back into her chair, exhaustion written across her face. She looked at the yellow envelope resting on the table. "Aren't you going to open it?" she asked softly. Arthur stared at it without answering. Something about the envelope unsettled him. It wasn't simply a suggestion from his son. It looked organized, deliberate, as if every detail had already been planned without their knowledge. Finally, he reached across the table and broke the seal. The first document made his stomach tighten. It was a reservation confirmation for a moving truck. Pickup date, the second Saturday of September. Delivery address, their home. Arthur read the date again. The reservation had been made nearly 2 months earlier. 2 months. At that time, Eleanor had still been recovering in the hospital, struggling to sit upright after surgery. His son had arranged a moving truck before either of them had heard a single word about leaving their home. Arthur slowly placed the page on the table. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered. He handed her the paper. Her eyes widened. "Oh, Arthur." Neither of them spoke. Arthur reached for the next document. It was a handwritten room assignment list. Raster bedroom, Ryan and Sophie. Second bedroom, children's room, recovery room, home office. Arthur froze. Recovery room. That room had been remodeled specifically for Eleanor after her surgery. He had installed safety rails, replaced the flooring, widened the furniture spacing, and moved everything within easy reach. Someone had crossed it out as though it were nothing more than empty space. Beneath the list was a note written in neat handwriting. Reome medical equipment before moving day. Arthur's hands trembled. Medical equipment. That was how they described his wife's recovery. Not Eleanor, not her needs. Just equipment. He closed his eyes for a moment, then he continued. The remaining pages were printed screenshots of a family group chat. Its title read, "Moving Weekend." Arthur wasn't part of the conversation. Neither was Eleanor. The oldest messages were several weeks old. Rebecca had written, "Let's make sure everything is ready before we tell them." Michael replied, "Already reserved the truck. Dad may argue at first, but he'll realize it's the only practical choice." Another message appeared from Ryan. "The backyard is perfect for the boys. They'll love growing up there." Arthur read the sentence twice. Not once had Ryan questioned whether his grandparents wanted to leave. He had simply assumed the house would soon belong to them. Farther down, another relative commented, "It's wonderful that Arthur and Eleanor finally agreed to downsize." Arthur stared at the words. Agreed? No one had asked them anything. Someone had created an entire story in which they had happily accepted a decision that had never been discussed. He carefully stacked the papers back inside the envelope. Everything suddenly made sense. The frequent visits, the compliments about the house, questions about the number of bedrooms, Rebecca asking where important documents were stored, Ryan measuring the backyard while pretending to play with his sons. They hadn't been visiting family. They had been preparing for possession. Arthur pushed his chair back and walked slowly through the house. His fingertips brushed the hallway wall where faint pencil marks still showed the heights. Michael had measured every birthday as a child. He paused in the kitchen. Every cabinet door had been installed by his own hands. The wooden dining table had hosted birthdays, Christmas dinners, school celebrations, and quiet Sunday breakfasts. This wasn't simply a building. It held nearly 40 years of memories. He continued toward Eleanor's recovery room. She was resting with her eyes closed. The adjustable bed stood beside the window exactly where he'd placed it months ago. The walker remained beside her nightstand. Every improvement in the room existed because he wanted her to heal safely. Yet someone else had already imagined tearing it all apart. Arthur felt anger rise slowly inside him. Not loud anger, not explosive anger. Something colder, more controlled. He returned to the kitchen and placed the yellow envelope exactly where Michael had left it. Then he looked out the window toward the driveway. "If you wanted to handle this like a business deal," he whispered to himself, "then we'll handle it like one." For the first time since Monday morning, Arthur wasn't confused anymore. He understood exactly what his son intended to do. What he didn't yet understand was how far Michael had already gone to make that plan a reality. And Arthur was determined to find out. Arthur barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the handwritten room assignments inside the yellow envelope. Someone had already decided where every member of Ryan's family would sleep. His wife's recovery room had become an office on paper before she had even finished healing. At sunrise, he quietly dressed and left a note for Eleanor beside the coffee pot. Back in a little while. Don't worry. He climbed into his pickup truck and entered the address Rebecca had mentioned. The apartment building stood less than 15 minutes away. From a distance, it looked respectable enough. But as Arthur parked across the street, the problems became obvious. The paint was faded, several windows needed repair, and the concrete steps leading to the entrance showed years of neglect. He sat behind the steering wheel for a moment. So this is where they expect us to live. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. A middle-aged man behind the reception desk looked up with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" Arthur introduced himself. "My son recently asked about an apartment here. I wanted to see it myself." The manager checked his computer. "Yes, Mr. Collins. Unit 214. Arthur's heartbeat slowed. They had already reserved a specific apartment. The manager grabbed a key ring. "Follow me." As they approached the elevator, the manager frowned. "Looks like it's out of service again." Again? It happens every now and then. Arthur glanced toward the staircase. 14 steep steps. He immediately imagined Eleanor climbing them after physical therapy. Even with her walker, it would be nearly impossible. They slowly reached the second floor. The hallway was narrow. The apartment itself was clean but small. The living room could barely hold a sofa and a dining table together. The kitchen offered little space to move around. Still, Arthur remained silent as he inspected every corner. Then he opened the bathroom door. His expression changed instantly. The doorway was extremely narrow. He measured it with his eyes before looking inside. There was barely enough room to turn around. No safety rails. No accessible shower. No space beside the toilet for a walker. Even if Eleanor managed to enter, she would struggle to move safely. Arthur swallowed hard. "When did my son first ask about this apartment?" The manager checked his records. "Almost 2 months ago." Arthur looked at him. The same week the moving truck was reserved. Everything had been arranged at the same time. Long before anyone had spoken to him. Long before Eleanor had even returned home from surgery. Outside the building, Arthur stood quietly beside his truck. His son hadn't chosen the apartment because it suited them. He had chosen it because it was available. Whether Eleanor could safely live there had never mattered. The realization hurt more than Arthur expected. Driving home, another question entered his mind. If Michael had planned every detail so carefully, what else had he done? When Arthur arrived home, something immediately caught his attention. The wooden key rack beside the front door. He stopped. Something was missing. For nearly 40 years, 5 keys had hung there. Now there were only 4. Arthur checked his own pocket. His house key was still there. Slowly, he walked toward Eleanor's room. She looked up from her crossword puzzle. "You're back already." Arthur smiled gently. "Eleanor, did you happen to give anyone a spare key?" She hesitated, then her face changed. "Oh," her voice became quiet. "Rebecca asked for one." Arthur remained perfectly still. "When?" "Several weeks ago." "Why?" "She said it was only for emergencies, in case something happened while you were out." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "I thought you knew." Arthur sat beside her and gently held her hand. "You didn't do anything wrong." Tears filled her eyes. She sounded so concerned. She said family should always have a spare key. Arthur squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I understand." But inside, another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The moving truck, the apartment, the room assignments now. A copy of the house key. That afternoon he picked up the phone and called Michael. His son answered cheerfully. "Hi, Dad." Arthur didn't waste time. "Does Rebecca still have a key to my house?" A brief silence followed, then Michael replied, "Yes, Mom gave it to her. It's only for emergencies." Arthur's voice remained calm. "What kind of emergency begins 2 months before anyone discusses moving?" Another pause. "Dad, you're reading too much into this. Am I? You know we're only trying to help." Arthur looked around the kitchen he had built with decades of sacrifice. "I'll ask you one question." Michael waited. "What exactly are you planning?" His son's tone became colder. "I'm planning for the future." Arthur slowly nodded. "So am I." Without another word, he ended the call. As he lowered the phone, one thought echoed through his mind. They hadn't borrowed a spare key because they feared an emergency. They had wanted unrestricted access to his home. And Arthur had a growing suspicion that someone had already used it. Arthur spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about the missing key. The more he replayed Rebecca's explanation in his mind, the less believable it sounded. If the key had truly been for emergencies, why hadn't anyone mentioned it to him? Why had it been copied during the very weeks Michael was arranging a moving truck and reserving an apartment? The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. There was only one person who might know the truth: his neighbor, Samuel Turner. Samuel had lived across the street for more than 20 years. A retired highway engineer, he believed in fixing problems with facts instead of assumptions. 2 years earlier, after a series of package thefts in the neighborhood, he had installed high-definition security cameras that overlooked the entire street, including Arthur's driveway. Arthur walked across the road that evening. Samuel welcomed him inside with a cup of coffee before asking, "Something bothering you?" Arthur nodded. "I need a favor." A few minutes later, they sat in Samuel's study as he opened the security system on his computer. "What day are we looking for?" Arthur thought for a moment. "About 3 weeks ago, Tuesday morning." Samuel searched the recordings before clicking on a video. There, the footage appeared on the monitor. Arthur immediately recognized his own driveway. The timestamp showed 9:46 a.m. His truck was gone. That was the morning he had taken Eleanor to her follow-up appointment. A silver SUV pulled into the driveway. Michael stepped out first. Rebecca followed. Ryan climbed out of the back seat carrying a small toolbox. Arthur leaned closer to the screen. None of them knocked. Michael reached into his pocket. He inserted a key into Arthur's front door. The lock opened. The three of them calmly walked inside. Arthur's heart pounded. They had the key all along. Samuel remained silent. The recording continued. 47 minutes later, the front door opened again. Ryan walked out carrying a tape measure. Rebecca looked down at her phone, scrolling through several photographs she had apparently taken inside the house. Michael locked the front door before all three returned to the SUV and drove away. Arthur couldn't speak. His own family had entered his house while he and Eleanor were away, not to check on them, not because of an emergency. To inspect it, Samuel paused the video. "I almost called you that day," he admitted quietly. "But I figured maybe you knew they were coming." Arthur slowly shook his head. "No." Samuel clicked on another recording. "I've got something else." This footage was from 2 weeks later. A dark sedan stopped outside Arthur's property. An unfamiliar man stepped out carrying a clipboard. He spent nearly 15 minutes examining the front yard. He photographed the roof, measured the driveway, studied the foundation. Then he carefully wrote notes before driving away. Arthur frowned. "Do you know who he is?" Samuel shook his head. But it looked like some kind of property inspection. Arthur stared at the frozen image on the screen. Everything suddenly connected. Someone had measured the inside of the house. Now someone else had inspected the outside. None of it had happened with his knowledge. Samuel printed a clear photograph of the stranger and handed it to Arthur. "You might need this." Arthur accepted it gratefully. "I appreciate everything." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "If you need the recordings, they're yours." Arthur thanked him before walking back across the street. His mind raced with questions. Who was the man with the clipboard? Why had Michael allowed strangers to inspect the property? What exactly was he planning? That evening, after Eleanor had gone to bed, Arthur sat alone in his study. He spread everything across his desk: the moving truck reservation, the apartment information, the room assignments, screenshots of the family messages. Now the printed photograph from Samuel. Each piece fit together like parts of a carefully designed plan. One detail continued to bother him more than the others. The stranger. He wasn't a contractor. He wasn't a repairman. He looked like someone evaluating property. Arthur opened his laptop and searched local real estate companies, hoping to recognize the man's face. Nothing. He searched appraisal firms. Still nothing. Hours passed without answers. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. There was only one person who could help him uncover the truth: his attorney. Years earlier, the lawyer had handled the legal paperwork when Arthur refinanced the house. He also managed their estate documents and knew every detail connected to the property. If someone was trying to claim the house through legal means, he would know where to begin. Arthur picked up his phone. The attorney answered after only 2 rings. "Good evening, Arthur. I'm sorry to call so late." "That's all right. What happened?" Arthur carefully explained everything: the envelope, the apartment, the copied key, the security footage, the stranger photographing the property. The lawyer listened without interrupting. When Arthur finally finished, several seconds of silence followed. Then the attorney spoke. "Arthur." His voice had become unusually serious. "I think you should come to my office first thing tomorrow morning." Arthur frowned. "Is something wrong?" "There are a few documents I need to show you." "What kind of documents?" Another pause. "They concern your house." Arthur's grip tightened around the phone. "Can you tell me anything now? I'd rather explain it in person." The call ended. Arthur remained seated in the quiet study, staring at the photograph of the unknown man. For the first time since Michael placed the yellow envelope on the kitchen table, Arthur realized this wasn't simply about moving his family into the house. It was something much bigger. And whatever waited inside his attorney's office the next morning was about to change everything. Arthur arrived at his attorney's office the next morning, carrying a folder filled with every document he had collected during the past week. His lawyer, Richard Hayes, greeted him warmly but without his usual smile. "Come in, Arthur." The serious expression on Richard's face immediately told him this meeting would not be an ordinary one. After they sat down, Richard opened a thick blue file. "I've reviewed everything you told me yesterday." Arthur nodded. "I need answers. You deserve them." Richard slid a document across the desk. Arthur glanced at the heading. It was a copy of the legal trust agreement he and Eleanor had signed several years earlier. "I remember this," Arthur said. Richard nodded. "Most people remember signing documents. Few remember every detail." He pointed toward one paragraph. "When you and Eleanor updated your estate plan, ownership of your house was transferred into a family trust." Arthur looked confused. "I know. What you may not remember is what happened after both of you approved the amendment." Richard turned another page. Arthur read carefully. The house would not automatically pass to Michael after Arthur and Eleanor's deaths. Instead, it would be sold. The proceeds would be placed into an education trust for every future great-grandchild in the family. No individual, including Michael, would receive ownership. Arthur looked up. "So, Michael was never going to inherit this house?" Richard slowly shook his head. "Not after the amendment." Arthur leaned back in his chair. Michael had built his entire plan on an assumption that was no longer true. "He doesn't know." "Does he know?" Richard folded his hands. "He assumed the property would eventually become his. Instead of asking questions, he made plans based on that assumption." Arthur sighed deeply. "So everything he's done was built on a false belief," Richard finished. Then the attorney reached into another folder. "This isn't all." He placed a second document on the desk. Arthur frowned. It was a mortgage application. His name appeared at the top. His address was correct. Everything looked normal. Until he reached the signature. His heart stopped. It looked similar to his handwriting, but it wasn't his. "I never signed this." "I know," Richard replied quietly. "The bank knew as well." Arthur stared at the document. Someone had attempted to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars using his property as collateral. The application had been rejected after a bank employee noticed the forged signature. If the bank hadn't caught it, Richard nodded gravely, you could have faced years of legal complications. Arthur slowly lowered the papers onto the desk. His emotions had moved beyond anger. He simply felt disappointed. Not because someone wanted the house, because that someone was his own son. Richard spoke gently. "Arthur, none of this changes who you are." Arthur remained silent. "It only changes how you protect yourself." He nodded. "So what happens now?" "First, replace every lock," Arthur agreed. "Second, document every conversation." "I already have." "Third," Richard smiled for the first time that morning. Remember that the law is on your side. Arthur thanked him before driving home. That afternoon, a locksmith replaced every lock on the house. Every old key became useless. When Eleanor noticed the new keys, she smiled with relief. It finally feels safe again. It is, Arthur replied. 2 days later, Michael arrived unexpectedly. He tried his old key. Nothing happened. He tried again. The lock wouldn't turn. Arthur opened the door from inside. Looking for something? Michael stared at the new lock. You changed it. Yes, you had no right. Arthur looked at him calmly. It's my home. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Michael asked quietly, So, what happens now? Arthur stepped onto the porch. I spent nearly 40 years building this home. I worked nights. I missed holidays. I repaired every broken board with my own hands. He looked directly into his son's eyes. You never asked for it. You assumed it already belonged to you. Michael lowered his head. Arthur continued. If you had come to me honestly, if Ryan truly needed help, I would have helped without hesitation. I still will. Michael looked surprised. I've already spoken with Ryan. Arthur nodded. I'll help him with a security deposit on a rental home. But the house? Arthur smiled gently. The house isn't the lesson. Michael frowned. What is? Arthur answered quietly. Family should never be built on entitlement. It should always be built on trust. Michael had no reply. For the first time in days, Arthur saw not the confident man who had arrived with a yellow envelope, but a son forced to face the consequences of his own choices. He walked back to his car without another word. Arthur remained on the porch until the vehicle disappeared down the street. Then he returned inside. Eleanor was waiting in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. Is it over? Arthur looked around the home they had built together over 4 decades. The photographs on the walls, the familiar furniture, the sunlight pouring through the windows. He smiled. Yes, for the first time in a long while, it finally is.